Good morning. I'm Kevin Clements, the director of the Toda Peace Institute, and it's my pleasure to be joining Dr. Volker Boege, Toda's SRF, working on climate change and conflict, in this public conversation with Frances Namoumou. Frances is the ecumenical coordinator for the Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice Program, Pacific Conference of Churches. She's an Itokai, indigenous Fijian woman, a Methodist and a social justice activist. Frances' current work focuses on the role and accompaniment churches provide towards communities faced with the dilemma of climate-induced mobility. She's co-convener of the Climate Change Working Group of the Commission for Climate Justice and Sustainable Development of the World Council of Churches. And she's a very accomplished woman. Frances, welcome to this public conversation with Volker and I.
Thank you, Kevin, for that question and the introduction. I have been working with the Pacific Conference of Churches since 2016. As Kevin mentioned, I am an Itoke woman from Nandronga, often referred to as the Coral Coast, which is about 45 minutes drive from our Nadi International Airport. I've also have maternal links to Naita Siri. These are two of the 14 provinces in Fiji known for their rugby rivalry. My childhood was largely spent around my parents, who were agricultural specialists, which meant we moved between various agriculture research stations in Fiji. And these experiences of adapting to new environments, making new friends, and engaging with different communities, I believe have influenced my interest in the environmental sector. My journey into the climate change advocacy began in 2004 when I interned with the World Council of Churches, coinciding with the release of the Otin Taai Declaration by church leaders in Kiribati. And returning to the Pacific Conference of Churches again in 2016, allowed me to bridge the gap between local community efforts and the global advocacy. I believe my previous experiences of working with the Adventist Development Relief Agencies, responding to flash floods in the Western Division of Fiji, and another project that focused on economic livelihoods with disaster risk reduction as the cross-cutting issue for economic livelihoods, and WASH, Water and Health Sanitation Project, funded by the New Zealand Aid government. I realized how much work has taken place in the communities and the efforts by governments, civil society, the sectors, and even the communities in trying to provide solution at that space. And so coming back to the Pacific Conference of Churches have allowed me, based on the observation, both at community level and the previous work with the World Council of Churches at the global engagement, realize the importance of linking local success stories to inform global climate negotiations. And I believe this has also led me to take up this role at the Pacific Conference of Churches, where I envisioned helping to elevate the voices and actions of communities at the global platform, and also highlighting champions from our region on this work on climate change. Yes, so that has been the journey for me for the last 20 years, at least, since I jumped on this work on climate change.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes, and it's interesting that you mentioned 2004. So obviously the churches in the Pacific have a relatively long history of engaging with the issues of climate change. Can you say a little bit more about how this started and how this developed over time?
Thank you. The churches in the Pacific have engaged with the issue of climate change longer than when I joined in 2004 with the World Council of Churches. This has developed through a series of significant, I guess, milestones and their involvement over time on this context. and even early awareness and advocacy from what we gathered when I joined in 2016, that there was already some initial engagement of Pacific churches with climate change that began late 90s. In 1997, during the Pacific Conference of Churches General Assembly that was held in American Samoa, climate change was identified as a pressing concern. The Assembly highlighted the importance of churches engaging with communities in these issues, and encouraged the development of projects to support local adaptation and resilience efforts. Then in 2000, the Pacific Conference of Churches, in collaboration with the World Council of Churches, published the Island of Hope. And this came out from a conference that brought member churches or church leaders from around the region again, and partners from the World Council of Churches, to highlight the importance of recognizing the impacts of globalization in our Pacific region, but also in how the environment had been used to elevate globalization in the world. So the publication marked a significant moment as it connected the climate change conversation to the broader context of globalization. They explored how global economic system was impacting the environment and contributing to climate change. And so this early work laid the groundwork maybe for the church's deeper involvement in the environmental advocacy. I guess the major turning point was in 2004, when the Pacific churches collectively released the Otin Taai Declaration during the Climate Change Conference in Kiribati, which was organized again between the World Council of Churches, Pacific Desk, and the Pacific Conference of Churches with their member churches here in the region. This declaration was a result of growing awareness that climate change was not just a local issue for an individual island nations like Kiribati or Tuvalu, but a collective challenge for the entire Pacific region. The declaration called for a unified church response to climate change, urging churches to work together to support their communities and advocate for global climate action. And since then, Pacific churches became increasingly active in both regional and global climate advocacy. The Pacific Conference of Churches played a very crucial role in bringing the voices of Pacific Islanders, faith communities, who are members of our faith communities, women's group, youth groups, their stories to international platforms, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conferences. And so the church's advocacy efforts have also focused on highlighting the disproportionate impacts of climate change on small island developing countries, and therefore calling for greater support from the global community. In this, these ongoing efforts have allowed the churches in the Pacific to continue to deepen their engagement in the climate change space, developing programs, initiatives to build resilience in the vulnerable communities, but at the same time, realize that the church cannot work alone. How do they collaborate with their governments, the civil society organizations in responding to the needs of communities? They've also been instrumental in promoting concept of ecological stewardship, which emphasizes the moral and ethical responsibility of caring for the environment. So the history of engagement really reflects the evolving understanding within the Pacific churches that climate change is not only an environmental issue, but also a matter of justice, human rights, and survival for the people of the Pacific. And since then, the churches have consistently worked to bring this perspective to the forefront of the global climate discussion. And in saying that, while I mentioned earlier that I guess the conversation around climate began in the late 90s, there was already advocacy or awareness happening before that. If we were to take it back to the 60s, when the nuclear testing was happening in the Pacific, the churches were vocal in campaigning against nuclear testing, which was how the Free Nuclear Campaign in the region started, from the churches, university students, communities who were affected, realizing that we need to protect our region from not only what was happening in the world, but our region being used as probably the dumping ground or testing ground. So, it draws back the work of the church long before climate change came into this discussion. There was already that ongoing advocacy on the environment and the protection of our land and our ocean in the late 60s, 70s until today.
Oh, that's really interesting. And recently, your Pacific Council of Churches organized a conference on revisiting the Otin Taai Declaration on Climate Change. Can you give us some sense of what the outcomes of the Otin Taai Plus 20 conference were and how that fitted into what you've just been talking about?
Yes, the Otin Taai is a Kiribati word for sunrise. So the Otin Taai Plus 20, as we had called the conference that we had hosted in May of this year, was organized by the Pacific Conference of Churches here in Suva, Fiji, was to mark the 20th anniversary of the Otin Taai Declaration. The first, I would say, the significant document that the churches in the church's engagement with climate change. The conference brought together church leaders, environmental advocates, community representatives to reflect on the progress made since the original declaration and to chart new pathway forward for continued action on climate change. So it was really a moment to look back in order to look forward. There were leaders who were present in 2004 that we were are not here anymore, but whose visions had allowed us to, the churches then, to see this as an important issue that the church in the Pacific needs to take up and prioritize. We were in a space where there were new faces in the room, new leaders in the room, who were already also engaging in the area of climate change, but there were those that were present back in 2004, were also present at our recent conference here in May, brought together this rich discussion around the shift from 2004 to the present. During the conference, we had Dr. Maina Talia, a prominent ally of the church in Tuvalu, and the wider Pacific climate community, who provided a powerful reminder using the biblical story of the Good Samaritan. And in his speech, he encouraged participants or the church to rethink our approaches and consider who our allies should be in the ongoing climate struggle. And the result of this conference was the Tua Koilei Declaration. The Tua Koilei is a Tuvaluan word for good neighbor. And the declaration emphasizes a broader understanding of who our neighbors are, not just those geographically close to us, like Australia and New Zealand, but also those far away, including the global north. It highlighted the interconnectedness of our global community, that the ocean connects us together, and the shared responsibility for climate action. The conference also brought attention to the idea that being a good neighbor extends beyond human relationships to include the natural world, such as the trees, the birds, the animals, our ocean and the marine ecosystem, and also the importance or the significance of our indigenous communities, the indigenous knowledge in that in shaping the response, how we respond to the climate crisis. There was a call also to honor the connections and respond to climate challenges with the same care and responsibility demonstrated by the Good Samaritan, aiming to heal, to restore, to rebuild our work together. I just want to highlight a few outcomes that came out from the conference, but also reflected in the Tuakwele Declaration. There was reaffirmation of the Otin Taai Declaration, reaffirming the principles and commitments of the original Otin Taai Declaration, emphasizing on the ongoing relevance of the church's role in advocating for climate justice and supporting vulnerable communities in the Pacific. It also highlighted the need to strengthen commitment to climate action. The renewed commitment to intensify our climate action at both local and global level, where the churches in the Pacific have to, the pledging to continue our advocacy efforts at all this level, but particularly, how do we become more, significant? How can we make move or shift the conversation at forums like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP meetings. There was also the focus on youth and indigenous knowledge, the significant recognition of the role or the engaging young people in these spaces, and integrating indigenous knowledge into climate action strategies. Participants recognize the importance of empowering young people and leveraging traditional ecological knowledge in building our climate resilience. This was important because even when the first gathering of church leaders took place, before the church leaders met, the young people met prior to that and came up with a statement informing or requesting or demanding church leaders of what they want as Pacific young people at that time. So this meeting reminded the church leaders how important it is to continue that engagement, how important it is to bring young people in the space, because they will be our present and future leaders, and they need to be involved in the conversation from the kickstart. We also, the conference also highlighted the need for stronger global solidarity in addressing climate change, that while the Pacific focuses on, our priority issue, how can we increase support from the global north, maybe financial or technical support to help or to assist Pacific communities in adapting to impacts of climate change. And last but not the least, an action plan. How do we map out as Pacific churches our action in responding to the climate crisis? What are specific initiatives that we can come up with if we're talking about reducing carbon footprints? What does that look like for the Pacific, for our Pacific churches? If we're looking at enhancing community resilience or advocating for systematic change at the regional, global, even in our national spaces, how does that look like? If we're talking about just transition, what would that look like? Yeah. So the overall Otin Taai Plus 20 conference is a critical moment, I believe, for a reflection again among the churches in the Pacific, reaffirmation and reinvigoration of the Pacific Church's commitment to addressing climate change, ensuring that the spirit of the original declaration continues to inspire meaningful actions in the years, the present and the years to come. That was really critical, at least as we move, now that we've passed our General Assembly last year, 12th General Assembly of the Pacific Conference of Churches, and looking towards the next 4, 5, 10 years.
Yes, thank you. That's very interesting to learn about all the work that PCC does at the international and the regional level. But let's turn to the local level now. And I think one of the strengths of PCC is that it's capable of working across these scales, from the international to the local. And can you give some examples of more recent work in the local context that PCC was involved in Pacific Island countries?
Thank you for that question. I think one of the strengths of Pacific Conference of Churches engagement at the regional and global platform lies in how we engage with communities at the local level through our member churches and other partners. Grassroots involvement allows us or sets the basis for us to recognize that, sometimes the language at the community level is very different from the technical language that's happening in the negotiation space or the climate space. How do we make the connection? But also that it's the grassroots involvement allows PCC to learn from communities' challenges, successes, which then informs the advocacy efforts that we do at the national level, at the regional and the global platform. We often talk about the 3 Ps here at the Pacific Conference of Churches: our prophetic, then the pastoral, then the practical. The practical approach for us ensures that the positions we take on these issues are grounded, that when we're doing our prophetic, when we're reaching out and trying to meet or influence our leaders, it is provided with enough solid evidence from what communities have done or what communities have experienced based on the different projects, based on the different initiatives that they have created over the years or they have implemented in their own communities of the years, that can inform our messaging or advocacy at those levels. We have done work in Kiribati, we've done work in Tuvalu. There's been engagements, especially in the climate change space, because where there are other programs happening at the Pacific Conference of Churches, but zooming into the climate change work, a lot of our work the last decade have focused around climate displacement, climate mobility. And so we realize that when we go into communities, there are different contexts. If I talk to communities in Kiribati about the issues of climate change in Fiji, they still see Fiji as this big island. They still have enough land to move to relocate to. There's still possibility of more adaptation projects, mitigation projects, whereas in the context of Kiribati, it's a totally different story. And, it made me just want to share this story. When we went at the Otin Taai conference, one of the key things that we often include when we're doing climate change project is community visitation. Having our participants to these conferences or meetings visit a community that's affected or visit a community that has, a resilient component in their ways of adapting or mitigating or responding to climate impacts. We took the participant to one of the communities that we're currently working with in Navua, Tongoru. They are non-indigenous. They live on the land that was gifted to them by the Tuinamosi. Relocation for them is a really difficult conversation because they choose not to relocate. They feel that there can be projects done on the community to allow them time to think about what their next steps are going to be. As Bani Dan, the spokesperson of this particular community, was sharing his story and took us to the coast and told us, we've lost 100 meters of land of, their beachfront. The moderator from Kiribati was standing there and he said, this was his reflection on that. 100 meters in Kiribati is the whole island washed out. I think these experiences or these stories or this engagement with communities grounds how we emphasize or how we advocate on these key messages when we are engaging at the region and global level. And it's really important to engage at the community level because it allows the church also to find ways and avenues to support the communities at large. In Kiribati and Tuvalu, when we supported the women in their backyard gardening. This was not an initiative that PCC just came up with. We found out that the Uniting Church of Australia, as a member of Pacific Conference of Churches, was doing this project supporting women. The project had come to an end. We felt we will continue this project. We'll support what has been initiated. So, there are times when I think over the years, I've learned here at PCC that we can be at the forefront sometimes in some of the engagement, leading, when we know that our engagement is more almost done. We step back slowly, because this is where there are other partners we feel need to be at the, in the space, or need to be in the communities to build on an area that the church might not be an expert in. That has taught us the importance of collaborating with other partners, other member churches, our member churches, the ecumenical body in the different countries, but also civil society organization. Critical in this engagement are other governments, because as we establish this engagement with our communities, with the churches, or with the civil society, the governments are also recognizing what that communities are doing and partners, but at the same time, we become relevant in informing policies and also national strategic positions. So for us, in order for the two Ps, the first P and the second P to be effective, prophetic and pastoral, the practical needs to be established really well. And this is also where the pastoral support comes in. So the role of the church in accompaniment becomes really relevant. A lot of our communities are going through trauma because of this, the impacts of climate change, finding out whether they were to relocate to food security, water security, I guess this is where the role of the church becomes very important in accompanying with the communities, identifying other avenues that can be sourced to support the current needs of the communities that we work with in the local context.
Great. If we focus a little bit of attention on the work you've been doing in Fiji, I mean, which most people assume, as you said earlier, is relatively well protected from the negative effects of climate change. I mean, what are the main problems you're confronted with in Fiji, and what specific contribution can the Pacific Conference of Churches make to address those challenges? I mean, for example, in Vunidogoloa or Narikoso, how do you respond to the challenges that those environments present you with?
The Pacific Conference of Churches in 2008 was approached by the government of Fiji to assist the planned relocation of the Vunidogoloa community. So briefly, the Pacific Conference of Churches for the last decade, more than a decade now, has been working or providing accompaniment to communities and churches who are in the forefront or the dilemma of relocating or not. One of the first assignment, I would say, was the Vunidogoloa community. The Vunidogoloa community in 2007 approached the government that they wanted to relocate, and the government approached Pacific Conference of Churches, along with the Methodist Church, one of our member churches, to provide support also in the process of relocation. It took the community 7 years to relocate. Vunidogoloa is a community up in the north in Vunidogoloa. Narikoso is a community down south in Kandavu. The difference between these two communities, Narikoso's case, only 7 homes. Those were in the red zone, most at risk, were relocated to a much higher elevated place. whereas with Vunidogoloa, the whole community from the coast were relocated 2 kilometers inland. 2 kilometers can be difficult. If we were to think about the changes in lifestyle, the changes in livelihood, the changes in the whole environment. One of the old ladies that we interviewed when the community first moved to the new site mentioned this. I no longer dream when I moved to the new place. I now forget the sound of the waves breaking onto the foreshore. It was a difficult time to process. For some, because it was 7 years, and I think this is critical in our accompaniment, in the pastoral support, because project runs within that period of 3, 5, 7 years, or even 10 years. Project ends, communities continue to live in those places, and even if they relocate, they begin to adapt, to make that place their own. And sometimes they still need to provide post accompaniment, which we've realized after the relocation in 2014 for Vunidogoloa, when we continued to visit the community, the men would sit around the cover bowl at night and talk about issues. The talanoa, they would drink cover, talk about the issues, and you could hear they were going through their own trauma because of what has happened. It's important to note that before the decision to relocate, they had to fast and pray for 1 year. For them, it was an opportunity to have a confirmation from God that this decision that they were making was the right one. And as they did this, there was also conversations around, what about our ancestors who have gifted this land to us to look after, to live on? Have they given the approval also? Sometimes the conversations around climate can be very scientific, can be very technical, that we lose the essence of a connection of people to the environment, the efforts, the spirit, the mana that provides the identity for people in this particular context. And I know this is defined in the conversation climate as non-economic losses and damage that people have. Sometimes it still needs to be unpacked, because in some of our communities, indigenous communities in the Pacific, you're talking about sacred totems, the sacred tree, the sacred animal, the sacred fish that are now endangered. How do you protect that when you are also trying to protect your own community from the rising seawater, from groundwater being inundated, from food security issues, water security issues, and of course extreme events that are now being experienced in most of our Pacific, not only in the Pacific but the rest of the world as well. And I guess the important role of the church in that space was to be able to leverage or to balance this. Yes, the project needs to happen, the relocation needs to happen, but how do you handle issues that are of significance or holds or the dignity of people when they are connecting, when they are connected to their land and their ocean and their environment? And we do not have, and for Fiji, we do not have a Fijian word that describes mental health, that, you can just unpack, or you can refer people to the clinic and say, have somebody speak to a counselor or something. It's those other spaces. Some of the pastoral support that was offered was just going back, sitting among people and listening to their stories. And as they tell their stories, they are also addressing solutions to some of the issues that they have talked about, or are also encouraging others, that they're not the only one going through this problem, but the others as well. And because of the way some of our communities are structured, patriarchal, women might not have this space often, as the men would sit around the growth bowl and who would be the ones talking more. We've also identified ways where we can engage with women alone or the young people. And we've realized how important it was to collaborate with other partners, because there was at a point where the churches realized, or the PCC realized, okay, our accompaniment have come to a point now that we can now highlight an issue that's coming up from the discussion with the communities. And that's when we start to pull in other partners. In our work in Narikoso, work in Vunidogoloa, we've realized the importance of engaging with partners like PCP, Pacific Center for Peace Building, Transcend Oceania. They come in with their experts in the area of peace building, conflict resolution. When relocation is happening, there's going to be conflicts if things are not done properly. There's going to be conflicts where we're contesting sources, whether it's water, whether it's land. When we identify this in the conversation, we realize that we may not be experts in these areas. We therefore then open the space for other partners who are experts in this area to come in and continue the accompaniment, but then are now highlighting specific areas and very specific issues. The work in Narikoso and Vunidogoloa was critical for us, because they were two of the initial projects that the Pacific Conference of Churches was involved in. And it has allowed us to, when we're moving into Kiribati, Tuvalu, and other spaces or other communities, we are very conscious of the conversation. Who initiates this conversation? How do we plan the conversation that it's not us driving it? But we've always emphasized the importance of talking about, the alternatives for communities, that if this doesn't work, what else? That it needs to come from communities rather than us or the donor or other external partners trying to pressure the communities to take up something that they might not really want. So, the timing, the process, it takes time for people to talk about their fears, talk about their concerns, their issues, come up with ways to address this. But at the same time, if relocation is the next step, how does that look like? And this, this is all part. I think this is why it's important to have talanoa, the dialogue, that space where you're just talking to communities, where you get to listen to their own stories and how they hope and they envision their communities to be in the next, in the future. Yes.
Thank you very much, Frances. I think it's very important to highlight these cultural and spiritual dimensions of the issues, because they are often overlooked in the mainstream discourse. And you also talked about the importance of cooperation with government and civil society. Of course, in a cultural societal context like Fiji, there are also other actors who play an important role in community governance, the traditional authorities, the chief Fiji. How do they relate to these issues, and how does the cooperation with, for instance, the chiefs work from a PCC perspective?
They play a very critical role. We've always highlighted the three pillars that drives decisions, or three pillars that are important people that need to be in the space that we need to consult with. Wanoa is the traditional structure system. Lotu is the church of faith, spirituality, and Matentu is the governance structure and governance system. And because it's triangular, you cannot work with only two and leave one behind. The three needs to work together. They need to listen to each other. And I think you might see this very significant in Pacific Island countries, where the government will still need the support of civil society organization or the Vanua. The government will still need the Vanua to provide context, or refer to the Vanua for some form of advice on some context, on some issues. And at the same time, seek the church or seek the faith communities to provide their context as well in this three-dimensional pillar strategy, or maybe. And so the traditional leaders have been significant in our work. For Pacific communities, specifically here in Fiji, because most of the communities we worked with are based here in Fiji, in order for us to go to the communities, it is important that we go through the provincial office. The provincial office, part of the government structure that are assigned to administer Itoke or indigenous communities' welfare and their developments in these indigenous communities. So in going through the provincial gives the approval that we are welcome to go into the communities. And most of the communities that you might go to, either the chief is from that particular community, or would be living in another community, but very close ties to these communities. The traditional structure is is placed in such a way that we have relationship and ties to the chief, whether it's through our relationship by blood or it's the traditional role. And it's important that they are brought into the space, because if our governments see climate change issue as a priority, and to the extent that when communities are relocated, that responsibility, that traditional responsibility will be affected. The government, is informed of this. Churches are involved. It is important, therefore, for traditional leaders to participate or to be engaged as well. We have a community in Vunidogoloa, na Vunidogoloa. Only so the community is on the coast of Nateo Bay. They have their traditional role is to look after they protect the Lalangavesi. It's the installment stone, the stones where the installment of the paramount chief of the Kondrove province up in Vunidogoloa, is done. So every time they re-elect or they install a new chief, this is a community that does all this preparatory work to install the chief. And so they are the protectors of this heritage. The visible impacts of climate change is very evident on the village. Every time there's high tide, the whole village is flooded. And so there was the only 4 houses along the beachfront were relocated to the back of the village. And conversation, there was discussion with the paramount chief in one of the meetings where they said, would the chief allow them to relocate? Because relocating means the community will relocate while this heritage that they need to protect will remain on the land, will remain on that particular community. The response from the chief was, this is their responsibility. And for us, coming in as the church, it was a question of which is more important. The traditional role, people are important. Yes, their traditional role is important. But are we going to, for the sake of the safety of community, let them continue to live where they are, be exposed to the impacts of climate change, and emphasize that this is their traditional responsibility? Or are we going to offer other solutions to this particular problem? But it becomes very complicated, because if the community gets relocated, do they still hold that traditional role? Because that traditional role is only significant for this particular place. And that's probably the challenge with other indigenous communities. In the olden days, there would have been some decisions made, or a commitment, a traditional responsibility to the paramount chief or to the other villages around there. And if we're talking about that traditional role in the context of traditional chiefs being present in this conversation, they become very key in informing this very complex issue of traditional role to the Vanua, to the place, traditional role to the paramount chief and the province that they represent. And how does that look like if they are to relocate? Will they lose that responsibility? And I think that's where, yeah.
No,
and I think
that would bring us to that whole idea about how do you and the Pacific Conference of Churches bring together sort of the traditional indigenous knowledge and traditional leadership, climate science, and Christian spirituality. How does the PCC integrate these different variables?
We've continued to highlight the importance of engaging different partners. I think priority for us at the Pacific Conference of Churches is informing our member churches, providing them with the particular resources, information that they can use as they engage in their own context. What is also important for us, we accompany only our member churches in engaging with partners. Where we see relevance, there are, in the context of Fiji, we've taken church leaders to communities to be present and be able to engage with the communities. At the same time, the church leaders themselves are identifying ways to resolve the problems, the issues, whether it's the responsibility of the church or the traditional leaders, where the traditional leaders should come in, how important this is. So the Pacific Conference of Churches have had different engagement spaces. One is with the church leaders themselves, like the Otin Taai, being informed and being able to connect them to other partners. But when it comes down to community or local level, that's where because some of these communities are probably majority Methodist or majority a certain faith, Catholic maybe. How do we engage with that member church to respond to communities, support communities, but at the same time, bring in the conversation with the traditional leaders. As you mentioned, the science language is very critical to us because it informs also our advocacy. It informs also the information, the knowledge, the package that we give our community, our members, our member churches and communities that we serve.
Thank you.
PCC has been very much involved in the COPs, as you have mentioned. And now the Australian government is thinking of having COP31 in Australia in cooperation and partnership with the Pacific Island countries. Has PCC a view on this? And how is PCC going to prepare for and intervene in an Australian Pacific Island COP31 in Australia? Have you already developed some thoughts on this?
PCC has been invited in spaces where there's already conversations around COP31 and the hope that Australia will be hosting COP31. I think there's already positions from the different spaces that we've been into where we're looking to Australia not to use the Pacific, not to use this COP as just an avenue to use the stories from the Pacific and the engagement with the Pacific to push for the hosting of the COP, but we're hoping that they are intentional in their work, in their engagement, that when they say that they will be hosting the COP in Australia, the engagement from the very beginning in terms of the planning, in terms of identifying, partners in the region. They definitely will be engaging our governments in the Pacific, but I think we must acknowledge that in the past, our Pacific governments, when they attend COP, there was strength in government, civil society, faith-based collaboration, even the youth and the women's collaboration in those spaces. I think for us, it's wanting to see that shaping well in the development or the planning or the agenda of the COP31, that it's not just, yes, Australia wanting to host and use the Pacific in its vulnerability to, attract the attention to the region. But what else afterwards? Are they willing to commit to something prior or post COP31? Are we looking to Australia to make a big shift prior maybe, or after a commitment like that? Because, while we say Australia and New Zealand are our big brothers in the region, I think we're also looking to them to lead and to set good example as bigger brothers. And therefore, a lot of Pacific Church, even Pacific civil society, are monitoring the conversation that's happening around COP31 and how the Australian government is trying to shape the hosting of that COP. That the Pacific people or the Pacific communities are not going to just being used in that space, but that our involvement is intentional because we want a total shift, or at least some real commitments from our bigger brother here in the Pacific, Australia.
Do you think that the PCC and Pacific Island countries are winning the struggle against climate change? And if not, what do you think is the reason for not generating more forward momentum on adaptation, mitigation, and so forth? And if yes, what are the secrets of your success?
Yeah. I wouldn't say winning or success. I was in Rakiraki, one of the communities, just last week, and one of the ladies asked me, how much renewable do we need to stop climate change? That, stopped me there. And I said, okay, we need to talk about this. I guess for us, it's knowing that communities are understanding climate. They are able to interpret, they are able to read the language, understand the language of climate talks, but at the same time being able to connect climate impacts, climate change, why there's extreme events happening in the community, in our, now, why do we have long periods of drought season, water crisis, and being able to link this to the issues around, link this to climate and the climate change, but at the same time, finding ways to respond to them. Winning for us is, because if we're saying we're winning, we're competing against something. I think for us, it's more like the hope that we're providing enough resources, enough information, good and right information to our communities that they're able to adapt and mitigate and inform us again of what's best for them to respond. There are lots of networks, civil society networks, that are doing great work. What is unique about the church? Is it the language that we need to emphasize? The language of love, care for creation, stewardship, custodianship, God's creation, the peace, how do we make peace with our environment? How does this change lives or change people's mindset, that when they are shifting, it's not because it's the law but because it's the conviction, because you are Christian and this is the right thing to do. You're part of God's creation, therefore this is the right thing to do. And so I guess while, yes, there's the winning, we're trying to implement, we're trying to advocate at the same time. It also that shift every time there's a change, every time there's a celebration in a community. For us, we're taking a step forward. There's another community that's getting the information. There's another community that understands how we must respond. There's another community that now is jumping into the same wagon as we are on and trying to push on, fight for climate justice. So it's a reminder again that, yes, we will work together with everybody else, but at the same time, they always say that the church is the conscience of the society. How do we continue to be that even in this very trying times when there's every other things that's coming left, right, and center? How do we continue to be that voice that reminds people of our responsibility, our role as stewards of God's creation? Yes, and that's the hope that keeps us that tells us that we're moving forward slowly but surely.
Thank you very much, Frances. This was wonderful, and it was a wonderful wrapping up at the end. Thank you.
Yes, and from my perspective as well, as a sort of son of a Methodist minister, I want to thank you for being such an articulate exponent of Methodist social gospel, its prophetic part, its pastoral part, and most importantly, its practical dimension. So thank you for embodying all those things, and thank you for your vision and faith that all of these crucial challenges that we're facing will, in the final day of judgment, result in people becoming at one with their creation and the creation around them. So thanks very much.